Jack had always thought of himself as a simple man. He liked his coffee black, his steak medium rare, and his property untouched. So when he opened his mailbox one sunny Florida morning and found a letter from the local HOA demanding $35,000 in unpaid fees for a community he didn't even know he was part of, he was understandably confused. Confused quickly turned to annoyed, and annoyed blossomed into outright rage when he drove out to inspect his land, only to find 83 condos standing proudly where his peaceful patch of grass and occasional squirrels used to be. "Is this some kind of prank?" Jack muttered to himself, staring at the rows of beige monstrosities that looked like they were designed by someone who hated joy. He half expected Ashton Kutcher to jump out from behind a bush yelling, "You've been punked!" But no, this wasn't a prank. It was real, and it was absurd. Jack wasn't the kind of guy who got mad easily. He'd once spent 3 hours stuck in traffic behind a truck carrying live chickens and didn't even honk once. But this was personal. His land, his private land, had been hijacked by the HOA, who apparently thought property ownership was more of a suggestion than a legal right. And the cherry on top, they had the audacity to bill him for community maintenance fees, including landscaping for the condo's shared pool area. Jack didn't even own a pool. The HOA letter was signed by one Margaret Whitmore, president of the association, whose name sounded like it belonged to someone who wore pearls while yelling at cashiers for bagging her groceries wrong. Jack decided Margaret would be the first person he called. "Hi, Margaret. This is Jack Morgan," he began, trying to keep his voice calm but firm. "Oh, Mr. Morgan, I'm so glad you called," Margaret chirped back, her tone sugary enough to give anyone diabetes. "We've been trying to reach you about your overdue fees." "Yeah, about that," Jack said, gripping the phone tighter. "I don't think I owe you anything because I don't live in your HOA." "Oh, but you do, Mr. Morgan," Margaret replied cheerfully. "You see, your property was annexed into our community last year." "Annexed?" Jack repeated, blinking in disbelief. "You make it sound like you're running a small country." "Well," Margaret chuckled lightly, "it's all perfectly legal under Florida Statute 720. "I don't care what statute you're quoting," Jack interrupted. "You built condos on my land without my permission." "Well," Margaret said again, her tone shifting slightly into condescension mode, "you should have received notice in the mail last year." "I didn't receive anything," Jack snapped. "Oh dear," Margaret sighed theatrically. "Well, it's too late now. The condos are already occupied." Jack hung up before he could say something that would get him arrested. That night, Jack sat at his kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey and a stack of legal documents he'd printed off Google about property rights and HOA regulations. He wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't even particularly good at Monopoly, but he knew one thing for sure. This was war. The next morning, Jack hired an attorney named Phil who looked like he'd just crawled out of a law school textbook from 1987. Phil confirmed what Jack already suspected. The HOA's actions were illegal as hell. "They can't just annex your land without your consent," Phil explained while munching on a donut during their meeting. "It's like someone walking into your house and saying, 'Nice place. I think I'll move in.'" "So what do we do?" Jack asked. "Well," Phil said slowly, wiping powdered sugar off his tie, "you could sue them for damages and force them to tear down the condos." "Tear them down?" Jack repeated thoughtfully. "Yes," Phil nodded. "But it'll take months, maybe years, to get through court." Jack leaned back in his chair and smiled for the first time in days. Months? Years? That wouldn't be necessary. Not when he owned Morgan Demolition Services, the largest demolition company in town. "You know what?" Jack said with a grin that could have powered Las Vegas for a week. "I think I'll handle this myself." The next day, Jack sent Margaret an official cease and desist letter through Phil's office demanding immediate removal of the condos, or else legal action would follow. Predictably, Margaret responded with another sugary letter claiming the HOA had acted within its rights and that any attempt to remove the condos would result in counter-litigation. Jack didn't bother replying this time. Instead, he drove out to his property with a clipboard and started making notes. Structural weaknesses here, plumbing vulnerabilities there. Oh yes, this would be fun. By Friday morning, Jack's demolition crew arrived at the scene bright and early with bulldozers and wrecking balls gleaming in the sunlight like instruments of poetic justice. Margaret showed up 20 minutes later in her pearl necklace and matching cardigan set looking like she'd just swallowed an entire lemon. "What on earth are you doing?" she shrieked as she stomped over to Jack. "Just inspecting my property," Jack replied casually. "You can't demolish these condos," Margaret screamed. "Actually," Jack said with mock politeness, "I can demolish anything on my land because it's my land. But people live here," Margaret sputtered. "Not my problem," Jack said with a shrug. Margaret threatened everything from lawsuits to restraining orders to calling her cousin who worked at City Hall, as if that mattered. But nothing could stop what was coming. Not even Margaret's increasingly desperate attempts to bribe Jack with free HOA membership. By noon on Saturday, the first condo came crashing down in spectacular fashion as residents scrambled to pack their belongings into minivans while shouting curses at Margaret for getting them into this mess. Jack stood off to the side sipping coffee from a thermos as his crew worked efficiently to erase every trace of HOA arrogance from his land. When it was all over and nothing remained but rubble and dust clouds settling under the Florida sun, Jack walked up to Margaret one last time. "You know," he said cheerfully, "this could have all been avoided if you just asked for permission." Margaret glared at him silently before storming off toward her car, muttering something about calling her lawyer. Jack watched her leave with satisfaction bubbling up inside him like champagne fizz, and then turned back toward his newly reclaimed property with a smile wider than any wrecking ball swing could ever be. Jack wasn't one to let a good mystery go unsolved. After his demolition escapade, he knew he had to figure out exactly how the HOA had managed to pull off their audacious condo heist. It wasn't just about reclaiming his land anymore. It was about exposing the sheer absurdity of their actions. He wanted answers, and if those answers came wrapped in layers of HOA bureaucracy and legal jargon, well, so be it. Jack had time, coffee, and a healthy dose of spite on his side. The first step was simple: research. Jack dove headfirst into the murky waters of Florida HOA laws, which turned out to be a labyrinth of statutes, clauses, and subclauses so convoluted that even Kafka would have been impressed. Chapter 720 of the Florida Statutes, the Florida Homeowners Association Act, was particularly enlightening. It outlined everything from how HOAs could collect fees to how they were supposed to notify homeowners about changes in governance. Spoiler alert: the HOA on Jack's land hadn't followed any of it. For instance, Florida law required HOAs to provide clear and timely notice before annexing property into their community. Jack hadn't received so much as a postcard. Then there were the rules about voting. HOA members were supposed to have a say in major decisions like annexation or construction projects. Jack hadn't voted on anything because, well, he wasn't an HOA member. The more he read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a case of negligence. It was a masterclass in HOA arrogance. Armed with newfound knowledge, Jack decided it was time to dig deeper. He requested copies of the HOA's governing documents, the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, CC and RS, bylaws, meeting minutes, and financial reports. Under Florida law, homeowners, or in Jack's case, victims, had the right to access these records. Predictably, Margaret Whitmore, the pearl-clad president of the HOA, was less than thrilled. "You want what?" Margaret asked over the phone, her voice dripping with disdain. "Your governing documents," Jack replied cheerfully. "You know, the ones that explain how you legally built condos on my land." "Well," Margaret said after a long pause, "those are private records." "Nope," Jack countered. "Florida statutes say I'm entitled to them." Margaret hung up. Jack didn't give up. He sent a formal written request through his attorney, Phil, the donut-loving legal eagle who had become his unlikely ally in this saga. 2 weeks later, Margaret reluctantly handed over a stack of papers so thick it could have doubled as a doorstop. Jack spent an entire weekend combing through the documents with Phil by his side. What they found was equal parts hilarious and horrifying. The CC and RS were riddled with contradictions and vague language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. The meeting minutes revealed that most decisions were made by Margaret herself during emergency sessions, attended by no one else. And the financial reports? Let's just say they made Enron look like a model of transparency. One gem stood out among the mess. A note in the meeting minutes explaining that the HOA had decided to annex Jack's property because it was conveniently located. Conveniently located. Jack couldn't decide whether to laugh or scream. But the real kicker came when Phil uncovered a glaring legal error in the annexation process. According to Florida law, HOAs must obtain explicit written consent from property owners before annexing their land. Margaret's HOA hadn't bothered with such formalities. They'd simply declared Jack's land part of their community and moved on with their condo building spree. "This is gold," Phil said, munching on yet another donut as he highlighted the relevant statute in bright yellow. "Oh, it's better than gold," Jack replied with a grin. "It's dynamite." With evidence piling up like debris at one of his demolition sites, Jack decided it was time for some direct action. He filed an official complaint with the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, DBPR, which oversaw HOAs in the state. The complaint detailed every violation, from improper annexation to lack of transparency, and included copies of all relevant documents. The DBPR responded quickly, probably because Jack's complaint read like an episode of Law and Order. HOA Crimes Unit. An investigator was assigned to review the case and conduct interviews with Margaret and other board members. If there were any, Jack suspected Margaret ran the show solo. Meanwhile, Jack took his crusade public. He reached out to local media outlets and shared his story with anyone who would listen. Reporters loved it. A David versus Goliath tale featuring condos, wrecking balls, and one man's quest for justice. Headlines like HOA hijacks landowner's property and Florida man fights back with demolition crew started popping up everywhere. Margaret wasn't amused by the attention. She called Jack one afternoon in what could only be described as an attempt at damage control. "Mr. Morgan," she began stiffly, "I think we can resolve this matter amicably." "Oh," Jack said innocently. "Does that mean you're tearing down the condos?" "Well," Margaret hedged, "perhaps we could discuss compensation." "Compensation?" Jack repeated with mock surprise. "You mean like paying me for illegally using my land?" Margaret hung up again. By now, word of Jack's battle had spread throughout the community, and not just among reporters. Residents living in Margaret's condos started reaching out to him with their own horror stories about HOA mismanagement. Phony fines for non-existent infractions, arbitrary rules about parking and landscaping, and even threats against pets deemed too noisy. It seemed Margaret's reign of terror extended far beyond annexation schemes. Jack decided to use this newfound support to his advantage. He organized a town hall meeting where residents could share their grievances publicly while he presented his evidence against Margaret's HOA. The turnout was overwhelming. People packed into the local community center armed with printouts of fines they'd received for everything from holiday decorations to bird feeders. By the end of the meeting, it was clear Margaret Whitmore wasn't just running an illegal operation. She was running an empire built on fear and fines. Jack left that night feeling more determined than ever. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who'd ever been steamrolled by an overzealous HOA board. Jack's town hall meeting had been a resounding success. The residents were fired up, the media was intrigued, and Margaret Whitmore was probably somewhere clutching her pearls and plotting her next move. Jack, however, wasn't done. He knew the HOA wouldn't back down without a fight, and if Margaret wanted to play hardball, well, Jack had a demolition crew and a lawyer who could eat donuts faster than she could file paperwork. The first sign of retaliation came in the form of a letter. It was delivered by certified mail, which Jack found amusing because it made the HOA's nonsense seem official. The letter accused Jack of defamation, harassment, and his personal favorite, disrupting community harmony. Community harmony? Jack laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. The only harmony Margaret's HOA had ever created was the synchronized groaning of residents being fined for parking their cars half an inch over the line. The letter threatened legal action if Jack didn't cease his campaign of misinformation immediately. Jack responded by forwarding it to Phil, who read it twice and then declared it the most ridiculous thing I've seen since my cousin tried to argue that donuts are vegetables. Can they actually sue me for this? Jack asked. They can try, Phil said with a shrug. But they'd have to prove you're lying, and considering we have enough evidence to fill a small library, I'd say you're safe. Margaret wasn't done, though. A few days later, Jack received another letter. This one claiming he owed $50,000 in back fees for HOA services he'd never agreed to or used. The breakdown included gems like $2,000 for landscaping. Jack's property didn't even have grass anymore thanks to the condos. $5,000 for pool maintenance. He didn't own a pool. And $10,000 for community beautification projects, which apparently included painting the condos beige. A color Jack considered an insult to the concept of beauty. Jack didn't bother responding this time. Instead, he sent Phil a text that read, "Margaret's lost her mind again." Phil replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Things escalated further when Margaret filed an official complaint against Jack with the local zoning board. She claimed his demolition work had violated noise ordinances and disrupted the peaceful enjoyment of the community. Jack couldn't decide what was more absurd: the idea that bulldozers were too loud for people living in illegally built condos, or the fact that Margaret thought she could weaponize zoning laws against him. The zoning board scheduled a hearing, which Jack attended armed with his lawyer, his demolition permits, all perfectly valid, and his trademark smirk. Margaret showed up with what appeared to be half the HOA board, though Jack suspected most of them were just there for moral support since none of them seemed capable of forming coherent sentences. Margaret began her testimony with all the theatrical flair of someone auditioning for a soap opera. "Mr. Morgan has been nothing but a menace to our community," she declared dramatically. "His reckless actions have endangered lives and destroyed property values." Jack raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "He has no respect for rules or regulations," Margaret continued, her voice rising as she gestured wildly toward Jack like he was some kind of cartoon villain twirling his mustache. When it was Jack's turn to speak, he kept it simple. "All my permits are in order," he said calmly. "I'm demolishing structures that were illegally built on my land." The zoning board members exchanged glances before asking Margaret if she had any evidence to support her claims. She fumbled through a stack of papers before producing what appeared to be photos of bulldozers in action. Photos that did nothing to prove any wrongdoing. In the end, the zoning board dismissed Margaret's complaint entirely, leaving her fuming while Jack walked out with Phil high-fiving him like they'd just won a championship game. Margaret's next move was perhaps her boldest yet. She organized a protest outside Jack's property. A dozen HOA members showed up holding signs that read things like, "Save our community," and "Stop the madness." Jack watched from his front porch as they chanted slogans about preserving neighborhood values, a concept that seemed laughable given their track record. One protester even tried to block one of Jack's bulldozers by standing in front of it with her arms outstretched like she was reenacting Tiananmen Square. The driver politely asked her to move. When she refused, he simply turned off the engine and waited until she got bored and left. By now, Jack had become something of a local celebrity. His story had been picked up by national news outlets, and people from all over were reaching out to share their own HOA horror stories. One man emailed him about how his HOA fined him $500 for having Christmas lights up past January 1st. Another woman wrote about being charged $1,000 for planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. Jack decided to use this newfound fame to his advantage. He started a blog called HOA Chronicles, where he documented every twist and turn of his battle with Margaret's HOA while encouraging others to share their experiences. The blog quickly gained traction, attracting thousands of readers who cheered him on while venting their frustrations about HOAs everywhere. Margaret wasn't happy about this development either. She sent yet another letter accusing Jack of inciting rebellion against her HOA, a phrase that made him laugh so hard he nearly fell off his chair. "Inciting rebellion?" Phil said when he read the letter later that day. "What is she running? A dictatorship?" "Apparently," Jack replied dryly. Despite Margaret's best efforts, her grip on power began to weaken as more residents turned against her. Some even joined forces with Jack by providing additional evidence of her mismanagement, from questionable financial transactions to outright lies about community policies. By now, it was clear Margaret Whitmore had underestimated Jack Morgan, and she was paying dearly for it. As far as Jack was concerned, he hadn't just reclaimed his land. He'd reclaimed his dignity and exposed an entire system built on arrogance and greed in the process. Jack had always thought of himself as a reasonable man, but there was something about Margaret Whitmore that made him want to embrace his inner chaos. Maybe it was her unrelenting smugness, or maybe it was the way she waved HOA bylaws around like they were the Constitution. Whatever the reason, Jack decided it was time to go all in. If Margaret wanted a war, she was going to get one. And Jack wasn't pulling any punches. The first step in his master plan was simple: paperwork. Jack filed a lawsuit against the HOA for illegal annexation, trespassing, and damages related to the unauthorized construction of the condos. His lawyer, Phil, had never been more excited. "This is going to be fun," Phil said, grinning like a kid in a candy store as he drafted the complaint. "It's not every day you get to sue an HOA for being this blatantly stupid." The lawsuit was served to Margaret personally, and Jack wished he could have been there to see her face when she opened it. According to Phil, who had sent a paralegal to deliver the papers, Margaret's expression had gone from confusion to outrage in record time. "She looked like someone just told her pearls were out of fashion," Phil reported gleefully. Margaret's response came swiftly and predictably, in the form of yet another letter. This one accused Jack of abusing the legal system and undermining community unity. Jack couldn't help but laugh as he read it. Undermining community unity? The condos were built on his land without permission. If anyone was undermining anything, it was Margaret and her HOA cronies. But Jack wasn't content with just suing the HOA. No, he wanted to make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of operation Margaret was running. So he organized another town hall meeting, this time with an open invitation to the press. The turnout was even bigger than before, with reporters from local newspapers and TV stations crowding into the community center alongside angry residents. Jack started the meeting by presenting his evidence. Photos of the condos, copies of HOA meeting minutes showing Margaret's unilateral decisions, and legal documents proving the annexation had been done without his consent. The crowd gasped and murmured as he laid out his case, and even the reporters looked impressed. Then came the testimonials from residents. One by one, they stood up to share their stories of HOA overreach, fines for having the wrong shade of mulch in their gardens, threats of foreclosure over minor infractions, and even a bizarre rule banning wind chimes because Margaret found them distracting. By the end of the night, Margaret's reputation was in tatters, and Jack couldn't have been happier. Of course, Margaret wasn't going down without a fight. She hired a high-priced attorney who immediately filed a countersuit against Jack for defamation and emotional distress. Phil wasn't worried. "This is a classic intimidation tactic," he said confidently as he reviewed the filing. "They're hoping you'll back down." "Not a chance," Jack replied. The legal battle quickly became a spectacle. Court dates were set, depositions were scheduled, and both sides prepared for what promised to be an epic showdown. Meanwhile, Jack continued his campaign against the HOA with ruthless efficiency. He launched a website called HOA Horror Stories, where residents could anonymously share their grievances and post evidence of mismanagement. The site went viral almost overnight, attracting thousands of visitors and putting even more pressure on Margaret. Margaret tried to fight back by issuing statements through her attorney claiming that Jack was misleading the public and slandering a respected community organization. But no one was buying it. Not after seeing photos of her ridiculous rules and hearing first-hand accounts from residents who had suffered under her reign. As the court date approached, Jack decided it was time for his piece de resistance: a full-scale audit of the HOA's finances. He suspected there were skeletons in Margaret's closet, financial skeletons, and he wanted them exposed. With Phil's help, he petitioned the court for access to the HOA's financial records, citing multiple instances of questionable spending outlined in their meeting minutes. The court granted his request, much to Margaret's dismay. When Jack finally got his hands on the records, it didn't take long to find what he was looking for. Thousands of dollars spent on personal expenses disguised as community improvements. There were receipts for luxury spa treatments labeled as wellness initiatives, invoices for designer furniture listed under office supplies, and even a charge for a first-class flight to Paris marked as continuing education. Jack couldn't believe his luck. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was outright embezzlement. Armed with this new evidence, Jack amended his lawsuit to include allegations of fraud and demanded that Margaret step down as HOA president immediately. The news spread like wildfire, and within days, residents were calling for an emergency vote to remove her from office. Margaret tried to defend herself at the meeting, claiming that all expenditures had been approved by the board, which everyone knew was just her. But it was too late, the damage had been done. By an overwhelming majority vote, she was ousted from her position as president. Jack watched from the back of the room as Margaret stormed out in defeat, clutching her designer handbag like it was some kind of consolation prize. He couldn't resist giving her a little wave as she passed by. With Margaret gone and his lawsuit moving forward smoothly, Jack finally felt like he could breathe again. The condos were still standing for now, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they came down for good. As he drove home that night, Jack couldn't help but smile at how far he'd come since that fateful day when he first discovered what Margaret and her HOA had done to his land. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments when he'd wondered if it was all worth it. But in the end, justice and revenge tasted sweeter than any victory he could have imagined. And if anyone ever tried to mess with him again, well, they'd better hope they weren't standing anywhere near one of his wrecking balls. With Margaret unceremoniously dethroned and the HOA in complete disarray, Jack could have stopped there. He could have sat back, sipped his coffee, and basked in the glory of his victory. But Jack wasn't the kind of man to leave a job half-finished, especially not when there were still 83 illegally built condos standing on his land like a monument to HOA arrogance. No, those condos had to go, and Jack was going to make sure their demise was as satisfying as humanly possible. The first step was to finalize the legal process. With Phil's help, Jack secured a court order mandating the removal of the condos. The judge, who seemed both amused and exasperated by the entire case, ruled that the structures were unauthorized and had to be demolished at the HOA's expense. Margaret wasn't there to hear the verdict. She'd vanished from public view after her ousting. But Jack liked to imagine her somewhere clutching a glass of Chardonnay and muttering about how unfair life was. Of course, getting the court order was only half the battle. The real fun began when Jack informed the HOA board, now led by a timid man named Gary who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, that he would personally handle the demolition through his company, Morgan Demolition Services. To say they were less than thrilled would be an understatement. "You're going to demolish them yourself?" Gary asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Yep," Jack replied cheerfully. "Don't worry. I'll give you a fair price." Gary looked like he might faint. But what about the residents? They've got 30 days to vacate," Jack said matter-of-factly. "Plenty of time." The residents, understandably, weren't happy about being evicted from their condos. But as much as Jack sympathized with their plight, he couldn't help but feel a little vindicated every time someone complained about Margaret's poor leadership. "You should have read the fine print before moving in," he told one particularly irate resident who accused him of ruining her life. "Next time, maybe don't buy property on stolen land." As the eviction deadline approached, Jack began preparing for what he liked to call Demolition Day. He ordered extra equipment, briefed his crew on the plan, and even considered hiring a marching band for dramatic effect. Phil talked him out of it. The local media caught wind of the impending demolition and started referring to it as the condo apocalypse, which only added to Jack's excitement. On the morning of Demolition Day, a crowd gathered outside the property to watch the spectacle unfold. Reporters set up cameras. Residents milled around looking both angry and resigned. And Jack's crew stood ready with bulldozers and wrecking balls gleaming in the sunlight. Jack himself arrived wearing a hard hat and holding a megaphone, looking every bit like a man who was about to live out his wildest revenge fantasy. "All right, folks," he announced through the megaphone. "Today we're making history. Say goodbye to these eyesores." The first wrecking ball hit with a satisfying crash, sending debris flying as onlookers gasped and cheered. Jack couldn't help but grin as he watched years of HOA tyranny crumble before his eyes. It was better than therapy, and much more entertaining. As each condo came down, Jack made sure to narrate the process for the crowd's benefit. "This one here? Built without permits," he said as another structure collapsed into rubble. "And this one? Funded with your HOA fees. Hope you enjoyed that beige paint job." By midday, most of the condos were gone, leaving behind piles of debris that would soon be hauled away. The crowd had thinned out by then. Most people had seen enough destruction for one day, but Jack stayed until every last wall was reduced to dust. When it was finally over, he climbed onto one of the bulldozers and raised his megaphone for one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said triumphantly, "justice has been served." The remaining onlookers erupted into applause as Jack took a mock bow before stepping down from the bulldozer. He felt like a hero in an action movie. Minus the explosions, though he briefly considered adding some for dramatic effect. In the days that followed, Jack received an outpouring of support from people all over town and beyond. His story had gone viral again thanks to footage from Demolition Day, and strangers were reaching out to thank him for standing up to HOA tyranny. One man even sent him a custom-made t-shirt that read HOA Slayer in bold letters. But not everyone was thrilled with Jack's actions. Gary and what remained of the HOA board tried one last-ditch effort to salvage their reputation by issuing a statement accusing Jack of being reckless and vindictive. Jack responded by posting side-by-side photos of his court order and Margaret's fraudulent annexation documents on social media with the caption, "Reckless? Vindictive? Or just right?" The post went viral within hours. With the condos gone and his land finally restored to its original state, minus some grass, Jack decided it was time to move on, literally. He sold the property for a hefty profit to a developer who promised not to build anything without proper permits this time around. The money wasn't even the best part. For Jack, knowing that Margaret's empire had been dismantled piece by piece was reward enough. As for Margaret, rumor had it she'd moved out of town entirely after her fall from grace. Some said she was living in a small apartment somewhere trying to rebuild her life. Others claimed she'd joined another HOA under an assumed name. Jack didn't particularly care either way. As far as he was concerned, she'd gotten exactly what she deserved. In the end, Jack walked away from the whole ordeal with more than just financial compensation. He'd gained a newfound appreciation for standing up against injustice, and maybe just a little bit of fame as Florida's most unlikely folk hero. And if anyone ever dared cross him again, well, let's just say they'd better hope they weren't standing between him and his wrecking ball dreams. Jack's victory over the HOA was the stuff of legend. People talked about it in coffee shops, shared memes of his wrecking ball escapades, and even started calling him Florida's Robin Hood. Except instead of stealing from the rich to give to the poor, he just bulldozed their condos. Jack wasn't sure how he felt about the nickname, but he had to admit it had a nice ring to it. With his land sold and his bank account looking healthier than ever, Jack decided it was time to celebrate. He threw a massive barbecue at his house and invited everyone who had supported him during his battle with Margaret and her minions. The guest list included Phil, who showed up with a box of donuts, naturally, several former HOA residents who had defected to Team Jack, and even a few reporters who wanted to cover the man behind the wrecking ball. The highlight of the party was when Jack unveiled a custom cake shaped like a demolished condo. "I thought it was fitting," he said as everyone laughed and cheered. Margaret probably would have fainted if she'd seen it, but Jack figured she was too busy hiding out somewhere far away from Florida, or possibly plotting her next HOA takeover. As the barbecue wound down and people started heading home, Jack found himself reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. It wasn't just about reclaiming his land or tearing down those condos. It was about standing up for himself and proving that even the most arrogant HOA couldn't steamroll over someone who refused to back down. But Jack wasn't done yet. Inspired by the overwhelming response to his story, he decided to turn his experience into something bigger, something that could help others who were dealing with their own HOA nightmares. And so, HOA Slayer was born. HOA Slayer wasn't just a blog anymore. It was a full-fledged online community dedicated to exposing HOA corruption, sharing resources for legal battles, and giving people a platform to vent about their ridiculous fines and arbitrary rules. Jack poured his heart into building the site, adding forums where users could connect with each other, guides on navigating HOA laws, and even a section for submitting anonymous tips about shady board members. The site took off almost immediately. Within weeks, thousands of people had joined, posting everything from horror stories about being fined for having mismatched patio furniture to triumphant tales of defeating power-hungry HOA presidents. Jack loved reading through the posts, especially the ones where people thanked him for inspiring them to fight back. One user wrote, "I used to think there was nothing I could do against my HOA, but after seeing what you did, I realized I don't have to take their nonsense anymore. Thank you for showing us we're not alone." Another shared, "My HOA tried to fine me $500 for having a bird feeder in my yard. I fought back using tips from your site, and they dropped the fine. You're a hero." Jack couldn't help but smile as he read these messages. He'd started HOA Slayer as a way to channel his frustration into something productive, but now it felt like he was making a real difference in people's lives. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about HOA Slayer's success. Several HOAs tried to shut down the site by sending cease and desist letters claiming defamation or copyright infringement. Jack wasn't sure how they thought they could copyright bad decisions. Phil handled each letter with his usual mix of sarcasm and legal expertise, ensuring that HOA Slayer stayed up and running no matter what. Jack also started getting invitations to speak at events, everything from local homeowner association meetings to national conferences on property rights. At first, he wasn't sure if he wanted to step into the spotlight again, but Phil convinced him it was worth it. "You've got a story people want to hear," Phil said between bites of a jelly donut. "Plus, think of all the free donuts you'll get at these events." Jack's first speaking engagement was at a small-town community center where dozens of homeowners had gathered to hear him talk about his battle with Margaret's HOA. He walked onto the stage wearing his HOA Slayer t-shirt and carrying a stack of photos from Demolition Day. "Let me start by saying this," Jack began as the audience leaned in eagerly. "If your HOA tries to build condos on your land without permission, don't let them." The crowd erupted into laughter and applause. Jack spent the next hour sharing his story. The absurd annexation scheme, Margaret's pearl-clutching theatrics, and the glorious moment when those condos came crashing down under his wrecking ball. By the end of his talk, people were lining up to shake his hand and thank him for standing up against HOA tyranny. One woman even asked for an autograph on her copy of Florida Statute 720. "You're like a superhero for homeowners," she said with a grin. Jack chuckled but signed it anyway. As word spread about Jack's speaking engagements, more invitations poured in, from cities across Florida and even other states where HOAs were running amok. Jack found himself traveling more than ever, meeting people from all walks of life who shared their stories and thanked him for giving them hope. Through it all, Jack never lost sight of why he'd started this journey. Not just to reclaim his land, but to show others that they didn't have to accept injustice quietly. Whether it was fighting back against ridiculous fines or exposing corrupt board members, Jack believed everyone deserved a fair chance, and he was determined to help them get it. And so, Jack Morgan, the man who once stood alone against an entire HOA, became a symbol of resistance for homeowners everywhere. His story reminded people that even in the face of overwhelming odds and beige condos, one person could make a difference. Now that you've heard Jack's incredible tale, don't forget to support this movement. Like this video if you enjoyed watching Margaret Whitmore's empire crumble under Jack's wrecking ball justice. Share it with your friends so they can join the fight against HOA tyranny. Comment below with your own HOA horror stories. We want to hear them all. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more epic tales of revenge and resistance.